plays have been one of those things that, for As You Like It, would they have just written that once with the idea of just performing it once, right? And that's what it was just for that time. And if it was successful, then it was successful. But is it a one-time thing? Was it like a...
Yeah, I think the theatre company would probably feel there were certainly some plays, not by Shakespeare. There were certainly some plays which they did seem only to perform once or twice, but they must have thought that was a dud and we're not going to do that again. I mean, that's an expensive way to run your theatre. But you're right to say, to suggest that they didn't have very many performances. So I think a good run of performances is probably fewer than 10 over a period of about 3 weeks.
Because what you were saying about the theatre rolling on...
Yeah, that's right. So what people want is new plays. Yeah. And then occasionally there's one that comes back and you say, oh, we can all go and see, there's going to be one afternoon of this. We think that London was pretty much full of playbills advertising what was on, although we don't have any of those that have survived. They're the real sort of ephemera, which probably was everywhere, and now we don't have any record of at all. But we think that this is how, there are accounts of how the players go out posting bills everywhere in the morning to say this is what's going to be on in the afternoon.
Is it conceivable then that Shakespeare could have actually written a bunch of really terrible plays as well, that we just don't know about?
You mean in addition to the ones?
In addition to the ones, yeah. The ones that we do know about.
I mean, there are some pretty terrible
ones we do know about, but the ones that literally just never saw the light of day, like they performed it once and it was just awful.
It's not, I don't think it is inconceivable, although I think, and I think it would be a sort of, it would be what George Bernard Shaw called bardolatry to say he couldn't ever have written a bad play. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But he is also a super professional writer, isn't he? And I think that that's quite an important part about how writing is seen in this period. That you're not allowed to have. You're not waiting for inspiration. You know, you're not writing a dud and you're more like. Just thinking about a sort of Victorian writer like Trollope or somebody who's just writing all the time, just to write 30,000 words a day, whatever, or 10,000 words, or however many he does before he goes off to the post office. You're just writing all the time, that's what you do. You're a professional writer, and you're writing out a standard, sort of all the time. And the other thing about Shakespeare is he's very canny about what audiences want. Not necessarily a radical writer. In some ways he's quite an old-fashioned writer in his own time. So he is writing... he's writing As You Like It, where they're all in the forest and retreat into this pastoral, very literary kind of pastoral world. At the same time, the other writers in other theatres are writing about, venereal disease in contemporary London and selling wives and making money and usurers and, the so-called city comedy. These are very, very gritty, very funny, very quick, very linguistically fertile plays. But if you went to As You Like It, you must have thought, wow, this is so...
Twee.
Yeah, I don't know whether you would have thought it was twee, but you would have noticed that this is not what people are writing. This is like the olden days. This is a bit old-fashioned. And we also know one of the ways we can trace Shakespeare's part in plays which we think were partly written by other people is that he consistently uses old forms, old grammatical forms, which people a generation later or Londoners are not using. So you can take the boy from the country, but you can't take the country from the boy. He's talking like a kind of provincial boy from the 1570s in a London which is full of sharp, clever, quick, university-educated people who are writing a very different kind of play. So he's not necessarily... We think of that he must have been innovative and he must have been cutting edge and he was challenging all these things. And in lots of ways that's true, but there's also a very definite way in which he's keeping a very clear eye on what's happening and where he wants to be positioned and what his plays are going to be like.
I just think it's strange that the reverence that we give him and his poetry and all that kind of stuff, when you look at him in the context of the time that he was, he's basically a pop artist. Like he is Quentin Tarantino. Like he is doing things that the kids are going nuts for.
Well, no, he's not. But he's not. He's Tarantino. He steals his style from lots of other people.
Well, so did Shakespeare. Like all of his big epic. He steals things from epic poems and then just turns them into something that is.
Yeah, so all of Shakespeare's stuff is based on other things.
Yeah, he collects stuff and then
So his
puts it out there through his
contemporaries,
lens.
weren't they?
So his what,
So
sorry?
his contemporaries were doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mostly, yeah. So, I mean, that's what writing was in this
Yeah,
period.
exactly,
You
yeah.
showed off what you'd read.
Yeah.
So
And you made
So
use of it.
that's essentially what you know, like big pop
Yeah.
directors do now, writers and directors. They kind of go, I read all these things and here they are through my lens.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. I think the reverence and the looking at it in that Elizabethan Tudor sense and kind of going, oh, this is very smart. He clearly was very smart, but he was also a pop artist.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, go.
They're sort of very male objects in that they were the actors who compiled it together and performed it, and it's, you know, what is there any evidence or implication that these were, you know, who was reading, who were they, what was the readership like, and was that more balanced, or are they kind of, is it by men for men?
I think that's a good point, and I think broadly speaking, yes, the theatre is a kind of homosocial world. It's where mostly men are still the audience. That changes a bit, particularly into the sort of 16 teens. We get more accounts of women going to the theatre than we did before, but before that, almost none. So probably this is an all-male environment of a particular sort. We do get women, so what people who own this book do is write in it, and they write their name in it usually. And that happens for the next 100 or so years. People are writing in this book, and then after that, writing in the book stops being such a thing that you would do. And so most of the annotations we've got from that 100-year period. And in that 100-year period, we get a lot of books with female signatures in them. So that does happen. It does happen that over that period, women start to read this book. I mean, obviously, English books are easier for women who don't have formal education in classics to have access to. They're a particular kind of woman, a particular social, in particular social status. We know a little bit about who bought First Folios early on. They're all men. That's because that's who we know about. The person we know best about is a man called Edward Deering, who is in his early 20s. He's inherited a big sort of stately home place called Surrenden House in Kent. He spends the fashionable legal term, Michaelmas term, in London every year, where he just all he does seems to do is to go to the theatre and spend money, particularly on clothes. He buys hugely expensive clothes all the time, and he also buys books. We know that he buys a copy of this book in December 1623. He's the first person we know to have bought it, and it's just possible that he's also someone who, early in the 1620s, commissioned a mashup of Henry IV's Part 1 and 2 into a single play, probably for amateur performance on his own estate. And it may be that he bought the First Folio. He seems to have bought 2 copies, but it's slightly unclear. He may have bought one of them with the name of getting some kind of performances out of it in his own household. Don't know that.
Why was the limit? I think you mentioned 1,200 copies. Was that where did that?
I think it's for 2 reasons. One is the kind of socio-political reason, which is an anxiety about how much stuff circulates. But the other one, which is probably slightly more important day to day, is a protectionist one, and it's about preserving work for compositors. So the compositors are the people who put the type into lines, and then into each line into a form, and the form is what's put down on the printing press, and the paper is put on it, and it's imprinted. And there was this is protectionist legislation, so that compositors don't just do one lot of work and have thousands of books printed off it, but if you want thousands of books, you have to pay them again to set it again. So I think we tended to think about it as a piece of political control over the circulation of text, and that's probably partly true, but maybe not as immediately true as we thought.
I was going to ask, when you were talking about, it was interesting to think about Shakespeare as being a bit old-fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I actually saw As You Like It here at Wadham, and I enjoyed it. And it seemed the way you all performed it, you kind of played on the modern interpretation, or played around with the gender a little bit. And I wondered if, of the plays, if As You Like It is considered a bit more modern and comparatively. And so it's just sort of a general question.
I think it's modern and it's progressive in its the issues that it brings light on gender and gender issues and sort of things like that. So I think it's progressive in that respect, especially when Orlando falls from Ganymede and that sort of homosexual elements are coming out. But I know a lot of Shakespeare's contemporaries were writing similar things, but I suppose it's considered more, I don't know, more.
It'd be great if the
maybe.
puns were more modern.
Yeah.
Have you got a really bad pun to give?
Oh, it's just, any kind of fooling is
Humour is always the hardest thing.
Yeah.
Always the
Because it's
hardest
just,
thing.
Anything
it
that
doesn't,
doesn't necessarily translate. We've
Doesn't
got
make
those language puns that we just don't use anymore.
You can tell who are the very learned members of the audience because they're, yes, I get that. And they're very loud laughs. And think, oh, yes, Sicky.
Yeah, you've got the footnotes.
But certainly in terms of our version of it, I don't think it's any more modern necessarily than any other play that we would have done in a similar way, because we live now, we have to do it through our with the ones channeling it, and we're doing it for a modern audience. So we kind of, I think that's always a question whenever we put anything on is who is this for, and is that difference between the reverential Shakespeare and actually he was a modern man of his time, so we've got to.
But also you cut, don't you? You'll cut.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You cut really well.
Yeah.
And that's something which I think reverential Shakespeare productions think, you can't cut them, you shouldn't cut them, and that just seems so wrong to me. You just you need to,
There's a big old financial issue there as well.
They are too long. They are.
But when you've only got 8 actors, and you've got to figure out whether one person can play 3 people and where they are at any one time. You've got to cut it. You have to.
Yeah.
It stops being entertaining as well if you leave everything in, regardless of whether or not you think a modern audience are going to. It stops. It depends what your goal is when you're putting on a play. Are you trying to create a historical document for what it would have been at the time, or are you trying to entertain people in the audience? Which is that's what we try.
It has to be made. You has to make sense to the audience who's watching it now. It has to read to them.
But it is interesting that the puns, even if we don't anymore understand the puns, even if you do understand the pun is not a very high form of wit for us right now, is it? It's what children. Just what children's jokes are about. It seems very unsophisticated. It's hard to imagine for us that this is really, for the grown-ups, this is kind of hilarious. Even if you do know, even if both the words and both the meanings are still in operation, which mostly they're not. Whereas for them, obviously puns, you get really, really serious thinkers like Thomas More or Erasmus or people who just obviously seem to love telling terrible puns. It will seem to be quite a high status intellectual game, these games in language.
it's the accent as well, and the sort of the dialect that you use. Like one has an As You Like It, I'm supposed to make a pun on goats and goths because it sounds so similar. And unless you sort of adopted a very weird accent just for one line, which I have been known to do. But it doesn't. You can't sell it. So.
But they did. I think. Certainly Peter Hall always says that they spoke very differently.
It spoke almost American. It was almost like American.
So that joke would have probably.
It was Ulster plus. Usually, it's sort of if you hear them doing sort of original pronunciation, so-called, it's kind of Ulster. North Carolina, Birmingham. That's the kind of triangle.
That's why it sounds.
Like Barry Rutter's sort of tag on his Northern Shakespeare.
Northern Shakespeare, it says definitely better in a lot.
Yeah.
I also think, there's a case, isn't there, for them doing it a lot quicker than We do it. The pace.
Yeah, I think they did do it, perhaps partly because of sort of the fluidity of scenes, but we don't really know what to make of the fact that they always talk about the length of a play as being 2 hours.
Yeah, the 2 hours.
2 hours talking about stage.
God, Romeo
You'd have
Unless that line was kept in and they cut it in rehearsal.
along with the other hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know whether that means they would have to go really, really fast.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what your sense of this is, but when I've been at the RSC, they've said they reckon 800, 900 lines an hour. That's kind of how they would deliver it. That's their sort of pacing, roughly. If you were looking at a script and thinking, how long is this going to be? Most of Shakespeare's plays are 3,000 lines, so you'd have to be doing it an awful lot faster to get them into.
Then it takes a while for an audience. I know whenever I watch it, the first 20 minutes, it takes a long time. It takes to kind of tune in to the language.
Yeah.
And then once you're in that, then the pace can
And,
pick up.
and usually it seems the first 20 minutes is kind of allowed for the fact that you won't be taking any notices.
Yes.
So it's curiously unimportant, isn't it, the first 20 minutes?
Or eating
That's right.
something, or
Is that to do with the nature of whether it would be performed and the groundings?
Possibly.
And like the first 20 minutes, people would still be showing up, which is why you have to talk about the plot and the intro like 3 times. We cut the beginning of the play like on this one because it's just kind of like, and here is what's happening. Oh, by the way, here is what's happening again, just in case you didn't get it. That's when you were walking in buying oranges. Like it's,
yeah, it could be. It
and
could definitely
could
be that.
also could that have something to do with the speed as well? Like the idea that not all of the text that we see written down would have been spoken, like people cutting the scenes short, going in, leaving, because it's all the actors who have learned this in a couple of days, and then just gone on and done it and just hope for the best. Like they have the blueprint of what the play's supposed to be, but they're just kind of like, right, we've got 2 hours, let's try and get out as many lines as we can and try and tell them a story. Like, is that...
Well, I think there's certainly
your approach to actually.
Yes,
that's what I'm doing every night. So
I mean, certainly as we were talking about when we were talking about Hamlet, the idea that these shorter texts we used to think were bad. I mean, they're probably much closer to what was actually performed, and it may be. I mean, there's a real scholarly argument about this that Shakespeare is writing these extended versions, more poetic versions, with an eye to readers, because they're much too long and much too complicated, and their pleasures are very readerly. You know, the pleasure of metaphors and similes is not really for most people in hearing them and moving on, but it might be in analysing them and see how they echo something before and flipping backwards and flipping forwards, and there might have been an element of that.
Did anybody study them in that way? I mean, is there comment that sort of indicates that at that time?
Well, it's quite, it's interesting. There's a so the main way people were encouraged to read in this period, to read seriously, was something we call commonplacing, which is really pulling out quotations that you think are notable, and they're usually notable because they are rhetorically very well turned. They're a sort of almost proverbial, or they're a sort of beautiful sentence, and it might be that what you were told to do when you were commonplacing was copy these out into your own commonplace book, which had headings a bit like a book of quotations might do now, like death or kings or the sun or love or something. And you copied these out, and then I think the theory was when you sort of wanted to write something about this yourself, you sort of looked at this collection of quotations and maybe you incorporated them in. So we can see someone, an essayist like Montaigne or something, you can see Montaigne's copying a commonplace book. He's thinking about, the end of life or something, and he just brings out, as so-and-so says, as so-and-so says, as so-and-so says. He's got this whole lot of commonplaces. But there's also probably a way that commonplacing was supposed to inflect your own use of language and make it more beautiful or more rhetorical. So lots of the things, and so this is all a way of saying, most early copies, including this Wadham one, of the First Folio, have marks for commonplacing. So somebody's done either a line or sometimes one of those things called a manicule, or a star or an asterisk or something. Sometimes they put what the category is, they're going to put this under. And sometimes they are beautiful phrases that we've always picked out, that continue to be picked out in quotation books. And sometimes they're not at all. So there's one that really sticks in my mind, which is in a copy in Glasgow, where, I don't know how many of you know The Tempest, but there's a scene in The Tempest which nobody really cares about, which is when Ferdinand meets Miranda. Miranda's grown up on the island, she's never seen any men. Ferdinand is a bit of a sort of lad and has seen lots of women, and they fall in love. And Ferdinand has this incredibly sort of slick, louche sort of chat-up lines, really. And this Glasgow reader, they're from Glasgow, I think the book is in Glasgow now, has just gone down through every one of Ferdinand's remarks. These are going to be so useful for me. When I meet this woman who's never met a man and is just gagging for it, this is what I'm going to say. Complete fantasist. And then, but all the stuff, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, all the wonderful lines in The Tempest, just no. I'll never be able to say that. Why would I use that? So there's one of my test examples for commonplacing is a line that we would now all pick out. My horse, a kingdom for a horse. Nobody picks that out in this period because it is really hard to think how you would ever use it. So it's not that kind of, that's not what you're looking for. You're not looking for the sort of completely distinctive. You're looking for something which could be useful and could be sort of put back into other things. And we definitely see that in these passages.